Hey, Composing Gloves here. I am wearing a hat. Today we're going to be going over the signal flow of Monark. I'm going to go over things that the advanced person should know, but we're going to be looking at a couple block diagrams, and I'm going to try and break it down in a way that the very beginner can follow if they know, what envelopes and oscillators and stuff are. So this is very, very important with the synth like Monark because it's trying to emulate, basically it's trying to be a mini Moog. And as a result, there are some features that go on under the hood that are clear in the block diagram, but not so clear on top. Things get the most complicated when we start talking about controller signals. But don't let it overwhelm you. And especially as we get into sound design, a lot more things will make a lot more sense. But it's important to get a general overview. So let's go to the manual real quick. Oh, real quick note. Go to the user bank initialize preset, and it's going to take you to its default preset. Change the range on oscillator 1 to 16 and the octave to 0. That's just because I don't know why, but it'll sound the same. It's just for whatever reason they pitch it down an octave and turn this up an octave. I don't know what the reasoning is, but we're going to go to the manual. So in the manual, there are 3 block diagrams that clear up some of this, and we're just going to go through. If you've never looked at one of these, don't worry. I'm going to make it make sense to you. Well, hopefully I'll make it in a way that you can make sense of it to you. So let's just get started. Whenever you see a box or a gray line, that generally shows a audio signal path. There's one exception or 2 exceptions. That is the filter envelope and the amplifier envelope. Those are signal generators that you do not hear, but you hear their effects. So these are called controller signals. I don't know why they are not like yellow or red or something, but they're gray, but they're not audio paths. Everything else though is an audio path. And then we have these 2 yellow and red. These are controller signal paths. So let's go ahead and start with the audio signal path and just sort of ignore the rest of it and just get a general feel for this. So first we have our 3 oscillators. So let's go to Monark. Okay, 3 oscillators. 1, 2, 3, check. If we play, that's our sound. So let's begin to make sense of why that's our sound. And okay, so we've got our oscillator, and that's where our signal starts. We're going to ignore the 3 moving out here because that's a modulation path we'll look at a little bit later. After our 3 oscillators, so our signal is generated, we go into our mixer. Our mixer is this guy right here. It's even labeled mixer. And we know that a mixer allows us to control the volume of various things. So we have our 3 oscillator volumes. So we can, turn the volume of 1 up, turn the volume of 2 up, and turn the volume of 3 up. Which 3 is a low an LFO right now, so we turn that up. There you go. Okay, cool. So that makes sense. And then we have these 3 knobs over here. Each of these fulfills a special function and has the load I think is actually the most straightforward of these because the noise does things. It can be white or pink or red or pink, depending on whether or not it's a modulation source or an audio source. So there's a bunch of stuff we're going to go into there. But basically we have our oscillator. It goes into our mixer. Cool. We're solid there. From there, we go into our filter. And from our filter, we go into our amplifier. Now, a quick note before we jump over to Monark, we have our filter envelope and our amplifier envelope. I'm going to assume you have a grasp on what envelopes are. Now, there's this contour knob here. And I'm going to just say this for another video because I get distracted if I start talking about this thing. It's a little more dense than I anticipated it being as a principle to explain because it sort of needs some examples. So we're just going to ignore the contour, but we have our filter. So we know that it goes from our oscillator to our mixer to our filter. Our filters are 3 low pass, basically. This is a modeled and then 2 different types of low pass, and then we have a band pass filter. So we understand, from our oscillator, we're setting the volume in the mixer, and then it goes into our cutoff. And one quick note, I turned my output of Monark down just because it was kind of loud, but you get the idea. It's going through here. I also turned the leakage off because I did that earlier. Don't worry about that. Just letting you know why things sound the way they do currently. And so as we move it down, all right, solid. So we've got that. And we know that this is being controlled by our filter envelope. We're going to talk about the relationship set up here, but basically I can turn this up over time. And let's turn our contour on. And we can use our filter envelope to adjust the way the filter cutoff knob interacts with our filter. We're going to be looking at this later in a lot more detail. And then finally we have now you see here, we have our filter, and that's represented right here. It says like filter, but where is our amplifier? And now the envelope on the amplifier is what we care about. But you might be saying, where's the amplifier? There's no spot that says like amplifier except for filter and amp. So where is that? That is this guy up here. I'm pretty sure. I could go into the structure and check. But basically, it's just the final output. So the volume of your final output is right here. And then we have the ability to shape it with an envelope. So that's pretty cool. We can have like we can have a pluck sound. This will sound more like a click, but there we have our pluck. There's the click I was talking about. So yeah, we'll be just a bunch of options. Cool. So let's go ahead and just undo everything we've done just to put us back at default. And I'm just going to move these two knobs back. All right. So that is our general audio path. That like makes sense, right? We're good there. So let's move on to the controller signals. So we see we have a modulation source and a glide wheel. Now in any synthesizer, they'll usually have some sort of a modulation. Otherwise, it's not a very good synth. The first one is our pitch bend. It just bends our pitch, like very straightforward. You'll see this, it's not represented on this one, but you'll see it represented on another block diagram. And we have our glide circuit. Our glide circuit is this guy right here. So, and we can actually manipulate how it interacts on panel B, which we'll look at in another video. So the glide circuit, all it does is its job is to pick how it's going to move to the next note. That's all. We're going to sort of just leave it at that for now, because we'll cover it later in the specific controls. But because Monark is monophonic, the way it chooses the note it's going to play next is pretty important, especially with this. And it also has a feature, I'm not sure if there's a fancy name for this, envelope retriggering, versus envelope summing or whatever, where instead of the envelope being retriggered every time you hit a new key, you can have it so that it will actually stack the envelope on top of itself, and that is more intuitive to play. We'll talk about this stuff later. Okay, so let's move on to the modulation. So we have this modulation wheel, and right now it's not going to do anything. And the reason is it controls the amount of modulation coming from a source. And the reason it's not going to do anything is because it's not hooked up to anything. We see we have these mod tabs. These modulation tabs link up the modulation wheel to various parts of Monark. Now, it will mix in a controller source. So it can take a source from oscillator 3. So oscillator 3 can be used to control the frequency of oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. It's like in the middle, so I guess that's what they were trying to go for. And or it could be used to control the filter cutoff knob when that's on. So as we move this up, it'll begin to control it. And we can very easily see this by simply, I'm going to turn this up to like 5 right here. And we're going to turn on the modulation tab. I'll put this in the middle. So here we go. So you can begin to hear it do its job. Or if we have it all around, there's no difference there. So we have to have it down a little bit in case you were wondering, why did you do that? Okay, so we have oscillator 3, and that's one controller source. So we can take this source and use it. The other option is we can mix, we could use noise. And if we look over here, it doesn't have this stuff on this. It's actually on another diagram. But this noise, in the previous video, I said you could switch between pink and white. Well, and when you're using it as a modulation source, this noise becomes pink or red. So red noise is just more filtered noise. There's a value, I believe, that exactly defines what it is. I forgot what it was. I believe there's also red noise in massive. But anyways, that's besides the point. It's just more filtered noise. So to give you an idea of what the noise sounds like, since we know and understand our signal flow, right now, if we turn our noise up, this is gonna send us white noise, and this will send us pink noise. Now just imagine that more filtered, and you have red noise. So pretty straightforward. But right now, this is going to send red noise, and this is going to send pink noise to the modulation. So anything that we can control with modulation can be used. Well, let me just show you. In this case, let's hook it up to these guys. And oh, I don't have an output. That's why. See, it's beginner mistakes, man. Definitely sounds like noise is modulating something. There are various reasons why you'd want to do this, but most of the time I leave it on oscillator 3. A quick note, you can do FM synthesis here if you turn on the modulator. Now, oscillator 3 is this key tracking switch. You want this off if you intend to use it as an LFO, because a key tracking switch, I have my hints enabled too, so I sort of have some helpers here. But the key tracking switch just makes it so it responds to when you hit a key on the keyboard, it will play that key. When it's off, it won't. And so it's a stagnant thing that can be used as an LFO. So if I play it now, we hear the frequency of 1 be modulated, and we can do that for 2 as well. So, okay, that is pretty straightforward. So that's modulation. See, it's not that scary. And if we move this down, it will simply mix between this. So that is what this thing here is expressing, and that's why the 3 is being sent here. Is 3 can be an audio source, or it can be a modulation source. Sometimes it can be both if you want, or if you want to use the noise. So sometimes you have to make decisions. So, okay, that is this one. You got it. We've achieved what we've sought out. Now, another quick note that I don't use too often, but this glide circuit, or at least I don't pay attention to it too often, this glide circuit moves, sends a signal to the oscillators, so it tells the oscillators how to glide between the pitches that they're playing, and it also sends a signal to the filter, which is an interesting deal. So just an important side note, maybe you're getting a behavior you don't like. I haven't ever really sought to take particular advantage of this feature, but it is there. So let's go ahead and move to the next block diagram. So this one says mixer signal of flow diagram, but it totally goes into the filter and feedback and master amp. And so this isn't just the mixer, but this first part is the mixer. Okay, so now we're taking a more in-depth look at this module right here. So here we've got 3 oscillators, oscillator 1, 2, and 3, and we've got our noise oscillator. Anytime you see a times, that just means that that's where the volume knob enters, so you can manipulate the volume, because in the equation, you'd multiply it by some number to change the amplitude. So I hope that made perfect sense. And then we have our on-off switch. So basically all it's saying is our volume happens before the on-off. And in this case, it actually does that on the panel, which is really nice. Sometimes they don't happen like they look on the panel. In this case, it's a visually correct signal flow. Okay, so oscillator 1, 2, 3, we could change the volume, and our noise, change the volume, or we could turn it on or off. We notice that an interesting thing happens. I don't know the exact reason for this, but it sums oscillator 1, 2, and 3, so they're all added together on a separate stage, and then the noise is added after. So that's, I don't know if that's important to you or not. This is a very important feature to understand the way this relationship is sort of set up. This load knob. So feedback will become a very interesting topic later on, but we have this load knob, and this load knob happens before the feedback path. You see here's the feedback path. It goes out through the feedback. It has a volume control and an on-off button, which is represented here, on-off, volume control. We have 2 feedback modules, but the load happens beforehand. So this just changes the way the load interacts with the feedback. This is a thing that happens up the signal chain. So it's an important thing to just be aware of. So we have our load, we have our feedback path, and then it goes through our filter and our amplifier. So it goes through our feedback. This was on the other diagram. I don't remember if I touched on this though. So yeah, so an important note about feedback, the way feedback works is it takes a signal at the end of a chain. So it's gone through, it's been generated, it goes through this chain, and then it snags it right before it goes to the final, right before it goes out, right? And it puts it back into itself. But this has 2 distortion units in it. So we see we have A and B. And while it does that, this is important too because this is there's a positive feedback loop versus a resonance, which would be a negative feedback loop. So whenever we get a self-oscillating filter, we'll talk about that later, okay? So, because I was about to go on a whole tangent. Basically, all it means is when it comes out, it has to go through our envelopes twice. And as a result, it does not create an endless feedback loop. That's why when you get a self-oscillating filter, it does not ring endlessly, is because it has to go through our envelopes again, and it can't survive that. So there you go. So it goes out there. So that's the feedback loop. And we'll look at that in more detail. That's sort of a more advanced one. But we go through our load, we have our feedback, our filter and envelope, and then out the master. So this one isn't too dense, but it's not just the mixer signal. So, okay, next up we have our final one, the scariest looking one. This is the controls of our modulation. Now, in this particular case, there are just a couple things going on here. It looks a lot scarier than it is. You can also ignore quite a bit of this. But basically, you see our fine tuning and our pitch bend, our octave, and our keyboard and glide circuit are all near the beginning. And you can see where there's synth. But you can see our octave has a particular relationship with the key tracking. So that's an important thing to note. I guess it's not really that important to note. You just need to understand that when you key track something, it changes the way. Here, I'm going to do a self-oscillating filter real quick. So you see there's no signals, and we're just going to go ahead and where is, let's bring this down. There it is. I'm like, where'd it go? Okay, so there's no signal. We're going to explain why this is going on the way it is later. But basically, the key tracking right now, if I hit any note on my keyboard, it plays the same key. If I turn key tracking on, it will begin to become sensitive. It will begin to account for information on the note that I'm hitting. But it's not totally accurate. If I turn them both on, though, it'll pretty much say which one's what. And so I could play it as a patch. So if I wanted a sine wave, which is not offered here, I could get it this way. And we'll talk about this a little bit later and how this works exactly. But an important note is you have to tune this with the cutoff. Like you can't just leave it. It'll be out of tune. Oh, unless this was a lucky shot. And so that's what key tracking does. It makes a control sensitive to the information you're playing on a keyboard. And you see here, this controls how sensitive. So we see if we have one key tracking on, it does 1/3, 2/3, and if both of them are on, it's actually 100%. And to know that, you either have to read the manual or use the help hints, which it actually says 100%. So you can see I've had things backfire me on a couple times and backfire on me. And so I've had to go in and figure out what the heck was going on. You can also see here on this diagram, we have our 3 oscillators going into our mixer, and we see we have our oscillator 3 and we have key tracking, right? So this makes oscillator 3 either responsive or unresponsive to the notes we're hitting. And you can see how it's being sent to control the oscillator 1, 2, and it can actually be sent, interestingly enough, if this is a dotted line, range tune to itself. I've not experimented with this relationship before, so I'm not going to say anything about it, but you can see it comes in here. And then you can also see represented here that if our noise is used as an audio signal, it becomes white or pink. But if it's used as a controller signal, it becomes pink or red. And then afterwards, it goes through our filter and our amp, and we can see our feedback loop is still represented. That's on all 3. So, the filter and amp are on all 3 as well. So I guess that's not like that crazy. But you get the idea. And hopefully at this point, you should have a pretty solid understanding of what's going on here, or at least be able to interpret the block diagrams a little bit better. So that's that. That's the signal flow of Monark. If you have any questions, let me know. I know there wasn't a lot of playing sounds. It was a lot of sort of, this is what's going on here. But I tried to show like the relationships as they happened. And as we get going here, we'll get more in detail on what's going on here. But now if something is happening in the background and I mentioned the signal flow in a passing thought, you'll understand sort of where that information comes from, how to obtain that information. And also you can begin to see the sound design applications. And this thing we'll explain a little bit later. Very cool feature, like so cool. So yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. Subscribe, support me on Patreon. It allows me to continue to make this content, and have a blessed day.